Start with the bill. We have a smaller one and a bigger one. That way the smaller one underneath doesn't have too much slack. Line up the edges first. And we got to even that slack out through the whole side. So I'll usually start in the middle, see if I can even it out on each side. Looks good. You can get a little bit of stretch on some materials underneath when you try to even out all the little rolls on top. And you compress that top layer just enough so that the slack is taken up, but when you sew it, you don't get your folds and things making your seam look all sloppy. Once you have a pattern really developed, I'll show a way to put little cuts. You sew one up after you do all this. Make little cuts, take it apart. Then you don't have to do these clips anymore. You just have cuts to follow. So as you're sewing around the seam, you line those cuts up, maybe 8 cuts or something. But anytime I'm developing a pattern, I use these clips just to get everything just right. And it takes me making a few of something before I even get those cuts I was talking about in the right spot. See a fold starting to pop up. So I usually have the slack on the top piece so that you can see the folds coming off, even them out as you're sewing across the seam. So you can see that's the short piece. So when we stick a bill in there, this is like a cutting board material, thinner. I like to use a thicker, high density, something like this. But you need a stronger machine than what I have here to go through something like this. This will go through it, but I have to sit and turn it by hand. This stuff's actually about the same as most hat bills that you'd get anyways. Hats I make, I like to use a little bit thicker. So see that's the short end. So then all that material across that seam will come to the short side because that's the underneath of the hat. Pull it past the end by about an inch and throw a clip on. Get the rest of the seam all the way on the other side. And tug up on the other side. In this step I usually give it make it a little tighter. So I stretch the material just a little bit across this whole curve so that it pulls it a little snugger. So when we bend the cap, you can see wrinkles forming. Once you get sewn, it's better, but that way by pulling some of that tight, you won't get nearly the wrinkles coming across there, if any. And I just try to make each fold about the same, or not fold each. And I try to make the excess material on each side about the same amount at the same time. Keep everything as straight as possible. I have that fold right up to that edge. Pull from back and snug it up a little bit more as I throw these on. So that there's any slack. Helps keep even more of the folds out of there. And before I sew across that, I throw a couple more on the back side just to hold that material across there snug. And I butt it, I go up just over the plastic and then kind of rock it back and forth and pull that material and get it just off the plastic. I also like to put these at an angle so as it's sitting, they're not pulling on one side more than the other. A lot of times I'll throw a piece of wood with some strong double stick tape on the side here. Right in line with the needle, I'll find where I want my seam and my stitch line. Stick that down. And as I'm running this through, I start off of there so it comes in at an angle. This is going to be hidden when we sew it to the hat. But as soon as I get close up to where that plastic starts, it meets right up with the edge of that wood, and then I just keep this whole side right at that edge of that wood as I'm sewing around. It keeps that stitch spacing right on the nose. Past the plastic end, I like to turn and go straight to this corner. Holds all that stuff together nicely. So we're going to tuck that behind the seam when we sew it to the hat. You can see those angles coming in, and I go around and it pops out. The secondary stitch line across the bill is sewn later when we actually, after it's sewn into the hat, and the top of the hat gets sewn down to the bill. Find the good side. One of the easiest pieces. This is the top of the hat, and you're sewing the straight seam together. Again, I can still start one on each side of these clips. Line it up good. So something this small like a hat, it's important to have all your spacing, patterns, everything together real good. Little measurements can make a huge difference if you mess something up. I usually sew up one stitch past the actual end of the material where I get real close, so that when we spread pieces apart and sewing other parts together, that doesn't spread apart right there, creating a longer side. A lot of times I pre-fold these seam allowances out before I do this top stitch. Sometimes I'll just get it started and then throw it up here. Leather, I'll even tap with a little hammer or something just to flatten that seam down well. Helps everything look nice. Make sure you're feeling with your finger where that fold stops, so you can unfold it and get it situated. If you just start running across this stuff, then you gotta start pulling stitches, and if you're working with leather, those holes are there for good. Usually, especially if you're going to be tugging around getting stuff situated, stop with the needle through the material, because then it holds it in place. Otherwise you're going to slide off your stitch line. When I'm doing a top stitch, especially with the thinner materials, I won't back stitch on the ends because it'll bunch it up. So if you don't back stitch and you leave a couple inches of thread on the ends, and after you go across that seam, you can give it a little pull to set it where it needs to be. And I always run through on the right hand side of that seam, and instead of just going the same way through again and moving to the other side of the seam, I'll flip this around, so I'm always on the right side of the seam, so that my spacing is always right on the nose. That's just something I do. So I do have a standard sewing machine, and that would be good for sewing the material like this, but it's not working, so I just use this for everything. I think you can get a finer attunement, you can get a finer adjustment with a standard sewing machine, so you don't get any bunching. Kind of give it a fold just a little away from this side here, because then this piece is going down. Find the good side. And again, I usually start with the ends. Centered as good as you can. And looking at the slack in the material on top and underneath. Be just a tiny bit of slack on the top piece, the smaller piece here. This tends to want to move around, so you got to reposition it sometimes after pulling the clip. Across this other seam from the first two pieces. You can help to give it a tap with the hammer. Set the fold in. There's that piece. That's the top and across to the back. And this is the piece that goes all the way around. It actually sews this way. All the way around. I like to find the dead center of this one first. We're going to be sewing around this big curve, so I'll make a little snip right here. So we can line that right up with the middle of that seam. And right away I know because of the design of this style of hat. That piece we're going to be sewing across, it needs enough slack so that it sits nice and folds so that seam is up on top a little bit. So right off the bat here, I start to put some slack in that top piece and even it out as much as possible. So instead of going up to this curve and stretching it to meet that line like this, that hat will sit real funny and be tight underneath that piece of material. So I'll start to line it up, and to get it to line up after, I actually make a fold or some slack in that top piece and then just start evening it out, and then that'll give us that style where that material comes up and over so that seam rides nice right across the front. Line it up and then get a little slack. Enough to where it will easily be distributed when you're sewing, but not too much where you're going to have trouble keeping the folds out across the seam. Once I get to about there, come out and line up that last corner part here. And this curve is real tricky. It really helps to start the material out away from it on this piece and then just slowly bring it in, letting those folds and extra kind of distribute evenly. And grab a spot in the middle, throw a clip in. Sometimes it takes some adjusting back and forth, removing some clips to get it to sit nice. But after you do that a couple times and get those cuts I was talking about in there, there's a method where you won't have to use these clips anymore. So that's a lot of slack. Just keep trying to work it in as much as possible here. Those folds distributed out evenly. Compress that top layer, stretch the bottom one out just a little bit. But what seems like too much slack to even out can be done. It's just tricky. If you wanted to alter the pattern so that there's less of the slack, that seam would ride right in front, right across the very front bend. Sometimes it's unsightly because this seam will open up, it's right on the bend, start showing stitches, but it's all preference. I like this look myself. It's a little trickier, but looks pretty good. Again, we're starting from the center, so right away I'm starting to create that slack and even it out with every clip. once I get far enough around the front, I'll match these corners up again. Pull this piece out past and slowly bring it in, trying to keep all that slack even across the seam. Maybe come out from this side a little bit, create more slack in that top piece. Alright, since these as we're sewing around this seam, since this can lay flat, in the top section of the hat will have a bunch of folds in it when we lay it down. See how that side's flat when it's laid down, that side's all bunched up at the top of the hat. So what I'll do is I'll start the seam on the side so that's down on the top of the hat. I can easily manipulate and move around and even these folds out as we're going across that seam. It's evened out right across where the seam's going in, it'll be good. Keeping those edges lined up together. So I'm just spreading these folds out. Sure to work that slack in towards the needle as well and not continuously pulling it out, folding it away to keep it straight, because then eventually you're going to get it too loose on top and too much fold to all of a sudden have to try to throw under that needle. Now since that was the hard corner, I do it the way I suggested, with the flat piece down so I can work the folds on top. Well, now the slack is going to be kind of underneath here, but it's not as much, so it's a little easier to get lined up, and you can kind of feel underneath. Just continuously feel underneath for those folds building up. Disperse them. hard corner again. Just keep those edges lined up. Keep dispersing the folds out enough. See again, I put that needle down because I knew I had some tugs to make to reline this up right here. We'll go across and top stitch this seam on both sides like we did before. I usually make sure I have enough thread on my bobbins and things so that I have enough to at least get through that one seam. Otherwise, if you got to stop and then you're back stitching halfway across, you're going to leave all kinds of layers of stitching and it just doesn't look quite as nice. And this seam sometimes across that difficult curve here can bunch up and fold a little underneath, but it's pretty easy just to tap it down, distribute those folds. And again, right where that seam meets and we're folding that again, give a couple taps. Spread those seam allowances on each side before I run across under that needle. I'll give it a little press just to set that fold in. I don't ever pull the material apart as I'm running it through there, or you're going to start to see threads right in that center stitch. I have the needle down and I'm tugging around and pulling, situating, tap that down, and it gets off aligned. But the needle's in that stitch. So I'll kind of even that material back out flat so it looks nice, and then bring it right to that angle again so I'm already set up exactly how I need to continue that curve. Top section of the hat. Oh, we still got one more seam. It's looking pretty good. You can see how it wants to naturally sit. That little fold. But I always leave it inside out when I do these top stitches.